Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Rising Friday show. I'm Jessica Burbank, joined with Amber Duke. It's good to be with you in person.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.
Always. Let's get into this. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will not be in CNN's debate next Thursday, despite his best efforts to nudge himself onto the stage next to President Biden and Donald Trump. The closest he'll get is a TV screen to watch the televised showdown. The network released a statement Thursday saying he didn't meet the requirements to qualify. CNN's requirements include appearing on a sufficient number of state ballots, agreeing to accept the rules and format of the debate, and receiving at least 15% in 4 separate national polls of registered or likely voters that meet CNN standards for reporting. Kennedy was 1 poll short of reaching the necessary threshold.
The Kennedy campaign claims that they've collected enough signatures for ballot access, totaling 310 electoral votes, surpassing the 270 required. Election officials have not verified this. Kennedy released a statement following CNN's official decision.
The 2 other candidates don't agree on much, but they do agree about excluding me from that stage. That's why the Washington Post reported on May 17th that, quote, Biden's advisors quickly let it be known that they had not agreed to any terms that could include Kennedy. The Post also reported that, quote, one of the CNN producers on a Wednesday call with Trump aides had explained at the time that, quote, RFK Jr. will not be on the stage, end quote. While I'm flattered to know that President Biden and President Trump are frightened by the prospect of debating me, shutting me out of that debate makes a mockery of democracy.
According to The Hill and Decision Desk HQ, Trump has 41.2% in the polls, Biden has 40.2%, and RFK Jr. has 7.1%. So the 4 polls that RFK submitted appear to be from Harvard Harris, CNN, Forbes, Monmouth, and Quinnipiac, so 5. And they said that Monmouth didn't count, which is a little questionable to me because I've always thought that Monmouth was a pretty decent poll. I wonder why it doesn't meet CNN standards.
Yeah, they're one of the big ones. I think it's tough because RFK Jr.'s website says he, with the ballots he's on, could get a maximum of 310 electoral votes. Now, it's up to the secretaries of state to process all of that paperwork and the petitioning that goes into that. The infrastructure's almost impossible to figure out if you're an independent like RFK Jr. is. It's very expensive and very timely. And so the fact that he's at a point where he feels like the paperwork's in, and as long as it's reviewed and everything goes well, he's going to be on the ballot in enough states to be a contender here. It's a little bit sad that secretaries of state can be a barrier to access in that way, but it sounds like the polling is really what's getting in the way. That CNN maybe has said, oh, well, we can't wait around for the secretaries of state to count these, petition signatures and do all of the paperwork. We're going to rely on polls. But then to say that a Monmouth poll isn't a valid poll, it's a bit shocking.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's obviously intended to keep RFK off the stage. The rules were created between the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign and the CNN and the network at CNN. So they probably made the bar just high enough so that they had this big, rematch showdown between Trump and Biden back in 2020. And I'm kind of curious as to exactly how the debate itself is going to go between these two, because we now have learned more about what the rules of the debate are going to be. There's going to be 2 commercial breaks in a 90-minute debate, which is kind of a lot, actually. And then they also cannot have notes, which is advantage Trump, I think. But then there's a couple of things that are advantageous to Biden, which is that the microphones will be turned off when they're not speaking, so there will be no opportunity for crosstalk, and then there's no live audience. So I do think that maybe there's a little bit of an advantage Biden, not just because of the rules, but because if he's able to just kind of get through the thing, then that will be seen as a success to most people.
I'm wondering, will there be a prompter, though? Because CNN, there's no live audience. I could totally see CNN say, all right, if you have specific points you'd like to get to, here's some of the topics. You can prepare some materials. That would be another advantage for Biden. Trump notoriously has had problems with teleprompters lately, but I think Trump should call it out. They should just be very real about what the setup is. If there's a prompter that Biden's reading off of, you could say like, hey, I don't think this guy can speak for himself or think for himself. But really, the conversation most people are probably having today around this is, why do media companies have this much power in our democracy? Why do they get to decide who can be on the debate stage, which is how a lot of people who are undecided make their minds up? Let's see how each position stands up against each other. Would we compare them directly? And let's see more than what we see in, these sound bites and campaign speeches, where people aren't necessarily asked the tough questions that they're asked on these debate stages. I don't feel good that corporate media companies get to decide who's on the stage, the questions that are asked, and the rules of the debate.
Yeah, exactly. Because all of these news anchors have their own idea of what actually matters to voters. And we've seen in past debates where huge issues that are incredibly important are simply not asked of the candidates. I mean, I remember back in 2020, there were not very many questions about immigration, not very many about crime, but they asked a lot about climate change, which is like, fine, you could ask a couple of questions about it, but to have an entire debate segment about it when you're not asking about things that are actually in the top 5 of issues of importance for voters is such a huge missed opportunity and doesn't really allow the voters to properly evaluate the candidates. And then you have this problem where now we have Biden and Trump disagreeing on which networks they want to appear on. So they've agreed to this CNN debate. And then I believe there's an NBC News debate in September. But Trump has agreed to a Fox News debate that Biden doesn't want to do. And then there's another debate that Biden's agreed to that Trump doesn't want to do. And so you're not even really spanning the swath of news outlets that are out there, because they both have to agree to appear on it. And of course, you're going to get different questions from people at CNN than you're going to get from people at Fox News.
Absolutely. And the candidates saying a smaller network wouldn't be worth my time. I don't need to debate RFK Jr. He's never going to be viable. I just think it's a bad attitude. And it's definitely coming from the parties, because this is how they maintain their power, by having the debate stage only representing the nominee from either of the 2 major parties in the United States. And I think people are sick of that. And I'm not saying that a network can't invite them to come on for a debate and have it be their own rules and such, but we need some other platform to have these conversations. So many other countries have very tight timelines for elections, and it's become a money-making thing. CNN definitely gets a lot of viewers from this. They're considered a very reputable network because they have these presidential debates, and I think there needs to be some other platform, a town square. I'm not saying we should do it on X, but I'm saying we need somewhere to have a real presidential debate. I would like to see how RFK Jr.'s ideas match up against a right and a left perspective. We could have him on our show and we'll be proxies for either side.
Yeah, perfect. And I would probably bet that they're not going to ask very many questions about pandemic response, which is something that's been a huge component of RFK's campaign. It seems both Trump and Biden would kind of just like to move on from the past 4 to 5 years of that without really any accountability. And it's really unfortunate. I was really shocked to learn, by the way, back when they were doing the primary debates for the Republican presidential nomination, that these networks were paying millions of dollars to the RNC for the privilege of hosting one of them, which is fascinating because not only is the RNC and presumably the DNC, when they do this, making money from media corporations who they then have some incentive to basically play nice with, but then the media corporations are profiting from hosting the debates as well. I guess there's a question as to whether or not their ratings end up making them enough money in advertisement to match how much they pay to the RNC and the DNC to actually host the debate. But there's a huge conflict of interest there. I just reported in the July feature story for The Spectator magazine about how Rhonda McDaniel had instructed members of the RNC communications staff to not go after NBC News while she was actively negotiating her contract to become an on-air contributor. And then, of course, she ended up getting fired a week after they announced it anyway. So she was allowing, of course, the idea that she was going to make this 6-figure salary to color what the political individuals at the RNC were doing in regards to news outlets. So there is this just revolving door and specter of corruption surrounding everything that happens between the media and politicians.
When I was in Iowa for the Iowa caucus, it's amazing how many people there are like, this is just what we do. It's a part of the state's culture. But so many people were saying we get this big influx of economic activity because all of the campaigns are there. They're all spending money. Sometimes they're hiring Iowans. A lot of times they bring in people from out of state. But it's an influx of cash, and it was called the political industrial complex in America. And I think that's an interesting term because we do have an industry around political elections. People make entire careers working on political campaigns. I don't think that applies to me. I don't think I'm a revolving door of media. I took a job for like $20-something thousand knocking doors for Bernie because I wanted him to win. So I don't think I'm that, but I think there's a lot of people who are that, who are the high-level consultants working behind the scenes when they're on the political campaigns, making backroom deals, and then they're going off and getting media jobs. I think Jen Psaki is an example of how that happens, where you are a voice publicly for a politician, and then you go on to have a career in media. I think people are kind of sick of that. I think people are sick of that marriage, and they want a divorce.
Yeah, and there's one thing to provide analysis occasionally on a news network. Obviously, their perspective can be valuable to a certain extent, but often these people are actually presented as independent news anchors, like George Stephanopoulos. Jen Psaki is a perfect example. Simone Sanders, like all of these people are not billed as, former Obama or former Biden staffer when they're being put on these news programs as these objective analysts or as anchors even. And that is such a disservice to the public who might not know that they have this obvious conflict of interest. And your point about Iowa is great too, because when I was in Manchester, New Hampshire for the past two primary cycles in 2020, it was obviously very booming even despite what was to come with COVID. It was a couple of weeks before the lockdowns. But then in 2024, everyone who works in Manchester was like, what are we going to do? No one's up here because it's not a competitive primary. And they weren't going to get all of the income in the bars and the restaurants and in the hotels and all of the places that the reporters and the politicos usually stay to cover the campaign, because it just wasn't really of interest this year. And so they had basically created all of this infrastructure and planned for years on banking all of this money to help Manchester, and then it just didn't come.
Yeah, they intentionally make it so that it's difficult for independent candidates to come out and emerge as a viable contender, because they make it so you almost have to hire these consultants because there's so much nuance and so many specific things that you only know how to do if you've worked on a campaign before. And so I don't think we like that, but I think maybe one day we'll see an RFK Jr. or an independent candidate on the debate stage, hopefully in our lifetimes, Amber.
Yeah, and I wonder if maybe he could still qualify for the September debate, depending on what their rules are.
Yeah.
We'll have to see.
More
We're gonna
rising.
leave it. Oh, sorry.
More rising after this.